I've always loved that epic feeling of going up against a gigantic monster 10 or 100 times your size that you can get in certain video games like God of War. And I've thought a lot about how you can replicate that in Dungeons & Dragons, and so that's what I want to talk about in this video. I think that one of the coolest parts about Dungeons & Dragons is the wide range of monsters that you get to go up against. But there's no denying that some of the coolest monsters you get to encounter are the colossal titans of the game. I'm talking about monsters like the Kraken, or dragons, or even humongous elementals. Monsters that completely dwarf you in size and can give you a sense of the epic scale of going up against something that's leagues beyond your ability. Video games like God of War handle this exceptionally well, but on a surface level, games like Dungeons & Dragons don't seem to be designed to handle these kinds of scenarios. However, with the right approach, I think you're fully capable of replicating that feeling and experience that you get facing those huge titans and bringing that to your gaming table at home. Hi, I'm Jeremy, and this is Experience Gain. This is the series of video that I make all about Dungeons & Dragons and how to get the most out of your role-playing games. The key to this is to consider combat as a sequence of encounters rather than a single encounter. You have to consider each encounter as a different phase in the battle, and also think about how the situation of the battle changes from phase to phase. There are a few core elements to consider when you're thinking about this. First, the player's goals. How do they change from one phase of battle, from one encounter to the next? Perhaps in one of the encounters, they need to hold off the monster that they're facing for a certain amount of time until reinforcements arrive. Or perhaps they're specifically targeting a part of the monster's arsenal, like a piece of equipment or one of the heads of a hydra. The next piece is the environment. How does the environment change and react to the evolution of the battle? If your players were fighting on battlements before, perhaps the battlements have now crumbled and the second phase of the battle takes place in the city street below. Or if they were fighting on a volcano about to erupt, then it's likely in one of the phases, probably the climactic phase, that the volcano will erupt and will change the environment and change some of the environmental dangers that your players face. Finally, there's the monster's abilities. If, for example, the monster that your players are facing, like a giant shield golem, started out with a massive shield and one of the phases focused on taking out this shield, then in the next phases, the monster would no longer gain the benefit of that shield if it's been destroyed. And so its AC would be reduced, and it might react by putting forward different abilities. It wouldn't necessarily have the same attacks or use the same weapons that it had previously. In this way, you can show the monster slowly getting whittled down over time, or add some other interesting elements, like if they're fighting a black dragon, for example, have the monster go berserk in the third phase of the battle and start to attack more viciously, perhaps even gaining an extra attack or an extra legendary action that it didn't have in the previous phases. If you start to look at the combat in your game as a sequence of encounters rather than a single encounter, the next question then is, how do you link the encounters together? You might want to tie the triggers to go from one encounter to the next to the monster's HP level. Large monsters suitable for the epic sorts of battles that we're talking about typically have high HP totals, and so you can set arbitrary targets at different breakpoints to trigger going from one phase to the next, like if the monster is bloodied, for example. Or you might want to do the kind of thing where the monster can really only be defeated in the third phase, if the third phase is reached, and progressing from one phase to the next requires accomplishing the goals of each specific phase. Like if the shield golem just can't be taken out unless the shield is destroyed first. You don't necessarily want to state the goal outright, but you do want to make it clear to your players. You don't want to be too obtuse about it. You want to use your descriptions to allow the situation to give them the information they're looking for without telling them outright, but they should still come up with the answer themselves. If they do, it'll be a lot more satisfying and rewarding of an experience. And if they do make it to that third encounter, by the time they get there, the monster that they face there should be weakened. It shouldn't have its standard base stats from the book, most likely. Instead, it should have slightly lower hit points, or suffer from some of the drawbacks of the effects, the consequences essentially, of what the players have managed to accomplish in the previous phases. My hair is just out of frame, but it's going crazy up there. It's all just sticking up in the back. I consider the player's goals, the environment, and the monster's ability to be the core levers that you have to utilize to vary the experience of each of the phases of combat, to make each encounter in the sequence feel unique and rewarding in their own right, to make the overall combat experience more epic and more unique than anything your players have encountered before. And as you get better at linking them together and judging how to make the encounter narratively compelling and engrossing for your players at the table, there are also a couple other elements that I think you can include to take these epic battles to another level yet. The first is layer actions, and the key is realizing that these layer actions do not have to just feature the monster in its lair. I get that's a little counterintuitive given the terminology, but for this kind of epic battle, I think it makes sense to consider how the monster can impact the environment and to allow it to have some sort of feature to do so, either as a legendary layer action style ability or as an ability that comes into play between phases, almost as a cutscene or a skill challenge. And the skill challenge is the other option that I want to recommend. I think the skill challenges are best suited between phases. I know not everybody likes the comparison of video games and bringing that into Dungeons and Dragons, but I think it's a useful way to frame it. If a Kraken attacks a seaside town, perhaps between one of the phases of combat, you have a horde of Sahagwin that come out from the water to join it in its assault on the city. Repelling this assault on the city is something the players can do via an extended skill challenge, rather than having to actually do a minor combat encounter between this larger combat sequence. Throwing more combat in there is really just going to slow things down, but having it placed as a skill challenge will instead allow them to feel like they're mowing through enemies and will serve to vary up the feeling of this session and break up the monotony of having one combat encounter after another. I tend to design almost all of my combat encounters in this way, even when they're not for epic monster battles. I find that using this combat sequence approach serves as a really valuable gear shift at the table. It gives players a D&D experience that they're not very likely to have experienced before. I've already talked about this principle before in other videos, but I feel that when you challenge and confront your players and want to ratchet up the tension, it can be somewhat constraining at times to confront them in a way that they're already familiar with. For example, combat. Combat is something that a lot of players already know and understand well. And so using that as a tool to increase tension or to ratchet up the stakes isn't always effective because the players are so comfortable in that medium. They know the rules like the back of their hand. Switching the rules and situations up on them isn't about gamesmanship or just trying to be a combative or competitive DM. Instead, it's really useful when you have the trust with your players, because then not only do you get to provide them with a cool and unique circumstance, they get to engage with the game in a whole different and wholly unique kind of way. I also think it's best when it's a bit of a surprise. They think that the battle with the Kraken will be just a standard battle, but all of a sudden you start layering in all these elements. You have different phases of combat and the environment changing around them, and clear goals that the players need to accomplish in order to resolve the combat situation, rather than just dealing as much damage as possible. This fully transforms the combat experience from a simple hack and slash encounter into a fully narrative experience with its own ebb and flows and stakes along the way. It can be a fully dynamic thing even with secondary and tertiary goals, where if the players aren't able to accomplish a goal fully, later stages of the combat can be more difficult. For example, let's say that you were running an epic monster battle featuring a demon as the epic monster that your players were confronting. One of the phases of combat could focus on getting the players to activate as many altars as possible that would each further reduce the demon's powers. The players could only have a set number of rounds to accomplish this, and there could be up to, let's say, 6 altars, each requiring a set amount of time or an action to activate. Then, in the following round, you would reduce the demon's powers according to how many altars they had activated. All of a sudden, even secondary goals have stakes, and the combat evolves. Obviously, this system isn't going to be for everyone. It's mainly going to be for players and DMs who want to experiment at the table. But I think whether you're a new DM or a more experienced one, it's worth trying the system out, whether it's in smaller scale encounters or the kind of epic monster battles that I'm talking about now. Done this way, I think combat can be more rewarding and enjoyable. And so I think it also goes without saying that it's best if you either really enjoy combat currently, or if you don't enjoy combat so much and want to try a different approach to it. While each individual encounter in the sequence is going to be shorter, the overall experience of combat will likely be a lot longer in this system. And so if you're not enjoying it, or if it's not keeping you engaged, you should definitely alter it to fit your needs and to keep you and your players engrossed. As I hinted at before, I think there are two main situations where this system is best utilized. The first is in surprising your players. If you look back at the example I've been using of a Kraken attacking a city, that can be a sudden escalation in tension that really makes things difficult for the players and brings some heavy consequences down on the stakes of the campaign. Of course, it doesn't have to happen just when the players are in a city, it can also happen while adventuring. Consider the Kraken that ambushes the party in Lord of the Rings. Whatever the circumstances, if you go with the surprise direction, it's always best if the combat encounter, the combat sequence, is caused as a consequence of player action. Whether it's because they were too careless in making their way through the environment and so attracted the attention of this apex predator, or they made an enemy in the past that is now coming back with a vengeance, or they made an enemy in the past that they deeply offended who is now coming back to get its vengeance. On the other side of the spectrum is the long build-up and tension. One of the great advantages of this approach to design is that your players won't be able to kill your big bads in a single hit. The point here isn't to frustrate your players, instead, it's to make the experience more satisfying and rewarding for them. If you're building up an enemy to have a really dangerous reputation or to have a long-standing enmity with the players, then having the final battle between them be this kind of sequence will be a much more satisfying experience than a single battle where all they need to do is just deal as much damage as possible. Using the combat sequence approach and varying the kinds of encounters and goals and situation within each encounter, you'll have a much more cinematic experience that your players will find a lot more memorable. That's why I love the system and why I try to use it in almost all of the encounters that I design. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit subscribe. I make new videos every Friday, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.